Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Geographies of Incarceration, a 21st Century teach-in. I'm going to start this teach-in in a very unconventional way, but I think it is appropriate given that the occasion for this teach-in is the retrospective that has been unfolding for a few months now on the work and the life of Brother Sekou Sundiata. I met Sekou in the summer of 1994 when I was a member of the special committee of the American Center in Paris. And he and Craig Harris and Vernon Reed baptized that building. It was a brand new building designed by Frank Gehry in Paris, with an extraordinary work. And so it is in the spirit of the music and the poetry that they made that I want to begin this evening by gathering you in the room through the voice of the late, great blues man, Ed Bell. And the lyrics are from a song called My Crime Blues. And since the teaching, the learning that is going to occur here is learning that we hope speaks not just to your head and to your thinking, but to your heart and to your feeling. The challenge for me in starting this evening was to try to find some way that marries the theme of the evening to the spirit of Sekou Sundiata, who used the arts as a tool for civic dialogue and political education. So, and he used his body, as you will shortly see, when we see some of the excerpts from 51st State. So I'm going to ask you to use your bodies and take your hands and clap with me. I got the blues for my baby, she got the blues for me. Oh, blues for my baby, she got the blues for me. But I can't see my baby, and my baby can't see me. I'm gonna be condemned early tomorrow morning. Oh, I'm gonna be condemned early tomorrow morning. But I am not guilty, I ain't done nobody wrong. Oh, my crime, I really can't understand. I say my crime, I really can't understand. They got me accused of murder, and I ain't never harmed no man. Baby, please come down there for my trial, I say day. Will you please come down for my trial day? So when I be condemned, you can wipe my tears away. There's no need to cry, ain't no need to weep and moan. Ain't no need to cry, no need to weep and moan. Just try to get somebody to go on my bun. I think it's gonna be weeping, I say to moan. Oh, it's gonna be weeping, I begin to moan. Saying I'm I'm a poor boy here, I sure ain't got no home. The jury found me guilty, judge says, listen, I say here. Well, the jury found me guilty, the judge said, listen here. It ain't no fine for you, get ready for the electric chair. Oh yes. So the tradition in which Sekou Sundiata worked and to which he contributed so much goes back to Ed Bell and to My Crime Blues and even further. The idea of a geography of incarceration comes to us from the opening monologue of 51st State, which I'd like to read to you before we watch it. These are the words of Sekou Sundiata. I can trace the roots of my citizenship back to my birth, but my most favorite subject was geography. He's talking about school. I enjoyed thinking about where I lived in the housing projects in Harlem in relation to people in other countries, to the mountains and the rivers and the great oceans. I could even draw the map of the United States from memory, and I believe that I had some special knowledge of how the state of Florida felt sitting up under Georgia, stretching out into the Gulf of Mexico, the Atlantic Ocean, and the Caribbean Sea. And I used to be on the lookout for the Mason-Dixon line. Whenever my family drove down south, I wanted to see exactly where the double-faced gray areas of the north turned into the murderous black and white Southern rule of law. I even put a character named Mason-Dixon into one of my stories. His job was to meet you at the border and check your cars for weapons. It's a marvelous image, this idea of a geographic imagination mapping the landscape of what it means to be American, mapping the landscape of identification from Harlem with people in other countries, mapping the identification of his location to the mountains and the rivers and the oceans. I think it's very important for us to keep in mind that although the theme of this evening is geographies of incarceration, which means we will be talking about prisons and imprisonment. The geography, the actual political geography, the political cartography of incarceration is to be looked for in places that are not the prison or the jail, to be looked at in the apartment buildings and homes of people in Harlem, in East New York, in DC, in Detroit, to be looked at in prisons across the ocean, in France, in Brazil. And when we talk about geographies of incarceration, we're talking about practices where the carceral society in which we live extends its tentacles far beyond the prisons and the jails that we can see with the naked physical eye. So it's a political logic, a way of governance that Sekou locates for us when he asks us to think about America in terms of these geographies of the mind. So our hope is that one of the things we'll be able to do this evening is not only to do work in this room in the way of a traditional teach-in, but to get you to make associations, connections between where you are in this space to other parts of your lives and to other places where you might be able to take whatever it is you take away from this evening into work challenging the logic of a system which is determined to disenfranchise, to brand, to coerce, and to repress large parts of its population, ironically, sometimes in the name of freedom. So we're going to watch now excerpts. I don't know how long the excerpt is. A 25-minute excerpt, which is part of a documentary film that was made on the making of the 51st Dream State. And you will see, in addition to the material in the documentary about the process of the making of this magnificent piece, excerpts from the piece itself. So I hope that I have in some small way opened your minds to receive this extraordinary piece of work that we're going to see now. So tech people, wherever you are, take it away.
God came out of nowhere. That's all I can say. A woman falls down through a window on the world and splatters. Two more coming down right behind her holding hands. And I can't see.
I didn't understand until I saw the flames from the burning towers and smelled the smoke from the crater that you could see from miles away. I've been trying to get at this American feeling that surfaced in me. My writing life began from the outside looking in. I wrote as the un-American American. That's how I think and feel to this day. But that feeling is complicated by the aftermath, and it will have implications for aesthetic choices I will make. It seems that I'm being forced to confront, to imagine, to invent what it means to be an American again.
A bone breaks on the other side of my body, and then there's a piece of brain. There's a piece of brain on the steps. A piece of brain on the steps. And I know his brains. I know his brain. I know his brains because it's ticking like a watch.
The 51st Dream State began sort of in my own response to 9/11 and thinking about how, as an artist, I would begin to approach the post 9/11 America and thinking about the world and post 9/11 world. What did it mean for me to say that I was a citizen, an artist? What did it mean for me to be making art at this time? What does it mean for me as an African American man to be asking these questions?
And all of a sudden, I'm rolling around. All of a sudden, I can't see. I'm rolling. All of a sudden, I'm rolling around. And a stream of gasoline and broken glass and water. I can't breathe.
At some point I'm gonna move somewhere else, but there's just I have so many ties here in every aspect of my life.
The show sits inside of a larger project called the America Project, which is basically centered around public engagement activities designed to trigger a public conversation, critical public conversations about art, imagination, creativity, citizenship, democracy.
Hi, my name is Sultan Sharif. I'm a filmmaker. We talked a little bit about the relationship to geographic spaces and how that can define your citizenship. I went to France, for example, and they said, where are you from? I said, Detroit. I'm from Romulus, Michigan, but not a lot of people know what Romulus is, so part of my identity is that of Detroit, and sort of how you think about that and how you in turn relate to that. Are you only a citizen of that place when, like, the Pistons are playing, or are you a citizen of that place, you know, when there's an art show downtown or something like that?
I felt that I was in a blind spot right after 9/11, and I was looking for a clearing. And I set out then to develop a way to see, but I wanted to do it in conversation with many other people.
On the corner of Twilight and Cass, the shadows are creeping along.
A collaboration developed with the campus, with Imagining America, and through that partnership, a partnership then with Access, the Arab American National Museum, and these wonderful poets from Detroit.
I needed to understand that Fordism was fascism, to understand that Sacco and Vanzetti must not die.
All the men's eyes looked the same, black and dull as the dark.
I think one thing that's really emblematic of this process with the poets was that reading we did. Checkpoint, a concert of poets.
Enemy combatant, collateral bystander, co-conspirator.
Now the circle of blood, that's what we come in with. Tobacco roll, kunta kinte, Africa mambata, shit like that. You can separate yourself in the circle of blood.
Color doesn't matter, but noses do, don't you think? Roman are best, strongly arched, whereas the Maltese is so slight, and mine flares wildly.
This poem has checkpoints. Who does America belong to really?
Aurora had this poem. It was a kind of refrain in there. I think it was, this poem has checkpoints, you know. And we were talking, you know, and triggered by the poem, you know, the whole question of post 9/11, the whole question of security and personal security, et cetera, was very much in the forefront of our minds. And so the title of that concert of poets came out of that poem.
What is an American? What is your responsibility to most that suffer? This poem is my country. Checkpoints are found in reflections in the mirror.
A walk-in space on one hand, Oklahoma City on the other. It all goes back to Dallas. It all goes back to that magic bullet. It all goes back to Dallas. It all goes back to that magic bullet. It all goes back to Dallas. It all goes back to that magic bullet. Somewhere in America tonight, Americans are loving everything about the past, as long as you don't call it history.
It's a big production. You know, it's a lot of people, you know, there's sound, there's lights, there's video.
They really mean today.
It's very difficult to find that kind of technical or production support in a community-based facility. That does not, though, exclude community-based work. In fact, that's one of the things I'm most proud of.
You can drive up to the mall and get fries to go with that shake. First came the interstate, then came the information superhighway.
In the early days of the aftermath, I was in hiding from the lost army of protest, calling from the 20th century for something boisterous and skinny on the page. I began my heresy with the scratch and whisper of number 2 lead, spelling out the opening line from instinct to hand to eye, earth, water, fire, air. The city buckles from the cloisters to the South Ferry and collapses eye to eye with its forgotten underlife. I follow horse trails through secret pathways, indigenous ghost caves, and African burial grounds. A wawanko echoes down the streets. The untouchables and enchanters doo-wop and do-rag in a spot of starlight like they don't know they're dead, as if to say, see that star, see that light, this is what we always wanted to be.
I grew up a Muslim. My father was an Egyptian immigrant, undocumented, came here at 10 years old. So I think of myself as being part Egyptian. My parents came here on my mother's side from Lebanon. My great-grandfather came here in 1860 and homesteaded in South Dakota, and I think of myself as Lebanese in another way.
2 of the individual interviews we did, we edited and actually used in the show.
I've had the chance to go back to those countries and visit, and I am Egyptian and I am Lebanese. In America, somehow, they've got divides that are different. Their boxes are, if you're African, you're sub-Saharan African. If you're Asian, you're from China or Japan. If you're Arab, you're kind of one thing. And the diversity of what a African American is or an Arab American is endless.
A world of changes.
I think Seku's work crosses lines, brings people together, and it does it consciously. I think he understands the importance of recreating communities, and that static ideas about what communities are and citizenship is and people are need to be looked at and expanded. Citizenship is an interesting thing. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. To me, it doesn't mean that I blindly march in some army to do whatever I'm told to do, or I think like the president tells me to think, or it's us against them, whoever them happens to be today. I don't think that way. I think that you can be a citizen of a state and a member of the world and a member of humanity.
So close to you, I feel.
I wanted to build the work in an unconventional way, meaning that, as an artist, I typically, I work at home with my computer and with my legal pads and with my music software, et cetera, et cetera. And I also work with musicians, so part of it is social as well, but a great deal of it is solo, alone, that kind of companionable solitude. But because I was interested in the public implications of these questions, I wanted to build this work in conversation with as many people as possible.
Tonight, as percussive instruments, I will be using the vaginal speculum. I don't trust nothing that bleeds for 4 days and does not die.
I wanted to think out loud and have my thinking be influenced and shaped by what other people were thinking, and by the questions other people were grappling with as well.
I'm not going to wear that thing. You can't feel nothing.
The last time we did this in the fall, I was really kind of disappointed in you, Sekou, because we didn't do the national anthem. I thought, wow, how can we have a presentation about America and not sing our national anthem? Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring with the harmonies of liberty.
I didn't have the language, I didn't have the imagery, and so part of my research to performance method was to go to search for them, and to search for them with people who are struggling for the same kind of language and same kind of imagery.
We were singing the the Negro National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing. We were doing a community sing, in which basically we invited an audience to come in, and we sang some quote-unquote American songs, broadly defined.
A song full of the hope that the present has brought us, facing the rising sun of a new day begun. Let us march on till victory is won.
We use the occasion of singing this music to trigger these critical citizenship conversations, in the belief that music is a repository for all of this cultural energy and memory.
Said I wonder what's the matter with my long time here.
The hollow at the base of my throat aches with a searing, sad love of country, so strong I must have had it in me all along.
Hammering, I said the sky fell down, hammering and I almost drowned.
How did we get here, sitting together, sharing a meal? Two warring communities, two angry and suspicious families, two women tugging at my heart, pulling me in different directions.
House, hammering, I needed help somehow. Hammering, won't you ring, oh hammer?
They sold their farms, prayed aloud on a holy hill. What now? The second coming didn't happen.
Lost everything, hammering, I said promises. Hammering, I needed help to live. Hammering, won't you ring, oh hammer? Won't you ring, oh hammer? Won't you ring, oh hammer? Won't you ring, oh hammer?
As part of this large project called Art and Civic Engagement, initiative, our Art and Civic Engagement, a multi-year initiative at the Walker Art Center, Sekou came and visited in the context of that as an artist in residency through our performing arts department.
It was radio artist Mario.
We had organized a citizenship dinner, which is a format, a potluck format. So we was a small group, we were gathered around the table. It was artists and a filmmaker. There were a number of people from the community. It was about 12 of us. And as he does, Sekou was not letting us kind of pop into the, up into our critical kind of high-level mentation. It was more like, okay, guys, tell us your stories. Tell us the story about when you became politically aware, politically conscious.
I brought home a biography of Martin Luther King, and I had read it, and I thought, oh my God, this, I really.
How old were you?
7. I got one of the worst beatings of my life for reading that book, for reading it home, because I had a very racist stepfather. And at that moment, that was a clear moment for me, where I thought, he's wrong. I'm right, and I know it, even though I'm 7.
And you felt it.
That story never left me. I don't think it ever will. And what was so key about that is the point she made. The reason she was telling the story was to say that she knew she was right at that early age, that her conscience had been formed, and she was aware of that at that early age. And to me, on some level, there's a level of citizenship of conscience that we're driving at. That's really transnational.
I walked the Avenue of the Americas, past the photocopy gallery of the missing and the dead, mounted on buildings and store windows and lobbies, and posted on police barricades along the streets. People had made these impromptu flyers, like they went to Kino. They took these pictures, family pictures at home, and they put them on these flyers for people who were missing. And people, in an impromptu fashion, took all those 8x11 things and just posted them. And I searched for familiar faces, and I found a few, but the names were wrong. Yet I knew them all by their fictions. The light-hearted Capricorn from Seven Hills playing with her cat on a crate and barrel sofa. The Hindu newlyweds who immigrated from India to be in the Empire State.
And the pictures are, you know, what kind of pictures they are. You know, like somebody playing with their cat, and somebody, you know, at a wedding or at graduation, and you know, those kind of pictures. You know, I was just devastated.
I ran from the falling tower and I wandered for days. I followed horse trails through secret pathways. A priest kneels in the powdered ash. The rescue stops for the Holy Ghost and the angel of death to cross paths. Someone calls for the jaws of life, earth, water, fire, air.
Thank you so much. In the interest of time, we're going to invite our roundtable panelists to the stage. Carl Hart, Pat Williams, Michele Fine, and Kendall Thomas. Thank you so much.
So we're going to follow the following format. Each of the panelists is going to talk for about 3 minutes, I believe, and then we'll talk a little bit among ourselves, and then we will open up the conversation for your questions and comments. So why don't we start with my colleague, Patricia Williams.
I'm going to read sort of a mashup of some of the stuff I've written recently about, or within the last few years about prisons. So I hope it's okay that I read rather than just speak. But on a warm autumn afternoon, just such as this one today, on many college campuses, the intoxicating aroma of what is surely medicinal marijuana will be floating like a soft caress in the breeze. And hard-working students will be bent over their books, fueled up and inspired by amphetamine cocktails that promise to sharpen their overstressed young minds for the coming exams. On a warm autumn afternoon, just such as this, at the nation's poorer public schools, children, and I do mean children, will endure a daily police presence, including drug-sniffing dogs, full-body pat-downs, searches of backpacks and lockers, stops in the hallways, all in the name of searching for contraband. The poet Saul Chernikovsky has written, "A person is only the outline of his native landscape." So, mass incarceration, war on drugs, felony disenfranchisement, school-to-prison pipeline, stop-and-frisk, targeted red line neighborhoods, 3 strikes and you're out, the new Jim Crow, Rockefeller drug laws, gun culture, myths, political opportunism, lock 'em up and throw the key away. A person is only the outline of his native landscape. And I remember all the way back in the year 2000, I saw an article in the New York Post, because it's my favorite reading material, entitled, "Tired? Pop Your Pal's Ritalin." And the story featured interviews with students at NYU who were taking attention deficit drugs like Ritalin and Adderall without prescription. And the student who was quoted, and they were all pictured with names and everything else, sitting on the front steps of NYU's dorms, saying, "It's easier to bum a Ritalin from a roommate than to head to a Starbucks." And the piece went on to specify how much the going rate was in the dorms, about $2 a pill, I think, and bumming pills from each other was pretty much a part of student culture. That was in 2000, and by 2005, the phenomenon had become so common that one article in Science Daily was headlined, "The Ritalin Generation Goes to College." And the typical user was white, male, and well-focused. And the typical motivation was reportedly tied to the need to achieve. By 2008, the experts were no longer describing these drugs as remedies for attention deficit disorder, but rather as cognitive enhancing. And the esteemed journal Nature published or endorsed the idea as these drugs as a boost to memory and concentration, and by 2011, almost all articles on the subject of drugs on campus was called concentration aids that should be freely available because, as one expert put it, too often students who turn to study drugs are seen as a problem, not the victims of a more significant issue of academic expectation. Ah, blind justice. The Ritalin generation versus weed-smoking, crack-crazed inner-city thugs. Such very different discourses used to describe the mostly white young people who reside in geographic spaces like NYU or Columbia, as opposed to those discourses describing Black and Latino youths dwelling a few miles north in Harlem and the South Bronx. It is very hard to find journalism that speaks of selling or bumming pills in university dorms as anything like the moral equivalent of drug trafficking. Indeed, when poor minority kids are arrested, as they are at a rate of about 8 times that of whites, one never hears about the stresses that they're under or the student culture of self-medication or why they too might feel it easier to ingest illicit substances than a venti frappuccino at Starbucks. For impoverished kids, particularly kids of color, drug use is never tied to the struggle to compete in an unforgiving world. There are no study drugs or concentration aids in that world. For the bottom rungs of our society, in other words, there is no ecstasy or, by golly, Miss Molly, no hoo-hoo party drugs or velvet rope intoxicants. Only street or ghetto or trailer trash drugs with harsh, plosive consonants in their names like crack or crank. Now, sometimes there are exceptions, even if they often function as the exceptions that prove the rule. 3 years ago, you may recall that 5 white students at Columbia were arrested on drug dealing charges, LSD, marijuana, cocaine, ecstasy, the whole thing. And the students' defense was that they were merely trying to put themselves through a school whose tuition before room and board was then in excess of $55,000 and is more now. As New York City Police Commissioner Ray Kelly put it, this is no way to work your way through college. True enough, and I'm sure Mr. Kelly is making plans to stop and frisk all those on the Upper West Side who look like they could be Columbia students. For, by Mr. Kelly's general logic, we'd surely see a dramatic drop in the crime rate if the NYPD took this problem seriously. But, as we know, it begins with reefer madness and broken windows at the frat house, and then quickly gets dangerously out of hand. It's been empirically shown that Columbia graduates who go on to Wall Street firms like Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs often steal so much money to support their nasty little coke habits that they can bring down whole world economies. But seriously, it is understandable that some might see the arrest of these 5 relatively privileged Columbia students as an overdue counterweight to the careless scooping up of easier marks like poor minority kids. Yet, if a large factor in the U.S.'s over-incarceration has to do with the over-criminalization of drugs, it's well past time we analyzed our voracious, all-American appetite for uppers, downers, painkillers on a national scale and as part of an overall crisis in health and welfare. And instead, we divert resources from mental health or rehab and allocate millions to militarize our schools. But at this point, I don't really believe that this is a war on crime or even a war on drugs. I think we just want to do this. We take children as young as 10 to jail for wearing the wrong color socks or flatulence in class. We handcuff 6-year-olds for throwing tantrums and drag them to the precinct for mugshots. In New York City, police officers outnumber guidance counselors by more than 2,000. And so, the school-to-prison pipeline is the predictably insidious spawn of the war on drugs. And over just the last 2 decades, we got scared. We sent guns and billy clubs into our schools on purpose. We provided federal funds for massive surveillance systems. We slashed budgets for books, salaries, computers, psychologists, librarians, and buildings. We dealt with classroom overcrowding by segregating those with learning difficulties, shunting them into tracks where they have no choice. The most vulnerable targets may be children of color, but this war on drugs or kids is a war on all of us. Ultimately, the lack of due process protections and human dignity in ghetto schools leaches into suburban schools. It leaches from uptown to downtown. It doesn't really matter whether one demographic views it as protecting against the dark side with zero tolerance strip searches for ibuprofen, while the other side experiences it as an annexing of the prison industrial complex onto daily life. It doesn't matter. Criminalizing children and young adults in these inhuman numbers will have constitutional implications for generations to come. It is corrosive and rends the fabric of our erstwhile civil society, makes a lie of equal opportunity, and rewards authoritarian personality disorder at the expense of our humanity. For in the end, as the poet said, a person is only the outline of his native landscape.
We'll next hear from Carl Hart, Professor Carl Hart.
Good evening. Thank you all for inviting me. I tried to take seriously the question of when did I become politically conscious and the role of the arts. I am a scientist and I don't know much about art. And so I struggle with this question. But as I think about that question, I think about the artist, Gil Scott-Heron. Gil Scott-Heron lived not far from here. He died, I think, about 1.5 years ago. But Gil Scott-Heron wrote a song called "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised." And I was a young person, I don't know, maybe 12, 13, 14. And I think that's when I really started to become politically conscious. Then as I got older, as I became older, so sorry.
Well done. Well done.
Very well done.
We've all been terrified of that happening.
Here we go, sorry.
That's okay.
Actually, it's not. But.
As I became older, I started to learn more and listen more to Gil Scott-Heron's lyrics. I learned about Brother Fred Hampton through Gil Scott-Heron, the leader of the Black Panthers in Chicago, the young man who was killed by the FBI at the age of 21. I learned about Gary Tyler, young brother who was in prison in Angola, Louisiana at like 17 or 18 for a crime that he contends that he didn't do. I learned about apartheid through Gil Scott-Heron, not through text, but through Gil Scott-Heron. I learned about no-knock legislations through Gil Scott-Heron. I learned how to think critically through the music of Gil Scott-Heron. And then, now, what I do is I study drugs. And in Gil Scott-Heron's music, he talked about drugs quite extensively. Because some of you all may know he had a complicated public relationship with drugs. Gil Scott-Heron used cocaine, heroin, had a complicated relationship with these drugs, at least in the public's eye. And Gil Scott-Heron, for the most part, in his songs, he talked about the horrors of drugs, as many artists do. And in doing so, one of the things that we do is that we provide education about drugs through the arts, through songs, through music. And one of the things that I have learned, as now I've been studying drugs for about 23 years and have given thousands of doses of these drugs that Gil Scott-Heron was vilifying in many of his songs, one of the things that I've learned is that we have overstated the harms of drugs. And our overstatement of drugs have contributed to the vilification of drugs and then ultimately the vilification of certain groups. And it has contributed to this increased incarceration rates that disturbs us all. We can clearly mark when it happened. Before 1980, there were less than 500 prisoners in the United States. Now, there are more than 2 million. The major drug laws occurred in 1986, 1988, and that's where we saw this boom during the Reagan era. So I guess one of the lessons that I take from all of this is that the arts, could benefit, as well as science, could benefit by having collaborations to have a more realistic perspective about some of the things that concerns us in the society. And I'll leave you with this message. There has never been a drug-free society, and there never will be, and nor should there be. When we think about the various drugs that concern us in the society, cocaine is an important drug in medicine. We use it in medicine. We can use cocaine safely. Methamphetamine, it's the same drug as Adderall. As was said, Adderall certainly has a number of beneficial effects. Heroin, it's the same drug as morphine. Clearly, morphine has beneficial effects. And so, as we vilify drugs, we must be careful that this vilification won't be used as a tool to continue to further marginalize certain groups of people. Thank you.
Michele Fine.
Hi. So I can't be a teacher's college. How many of you are teacher's college students or faculty? So I can't be a teacher's college without thinking about the relationship of education and prisons. I graduated here. I often sit on this stage and admit to the audience that one of the lovers I take to bed is W.E.B. Du Bois's Soul of Black Folks. And one of the things that Du Bois talked about in when he developed Crisis Magazine was that he was committed to chronicling what he called the low moans of the darker race, and that he knew that those moans would only be attended to when there was a profit to be made. So I feel like we're in a moment, an historic moment, where if W.E.B. Du Bois and Naomi Klein, Disaster Capitalism, had a baby, it would be this moment. That is, there's a profit to be made from the moans in the darker race. So I wanna speak about privatization and punishment in public education, and the ways in which that is, in some ways represents the soft side of what you were calling the carceral tentacles. I have had the privilege of working in prison, and I'm happy to chat with you about that. I've had the joy of working with young people in the Bronx on stop and frisk research, which has had an amazing victory of recent. But I want to talk to you about the technologies of the carceral state that I think many of you are engaged in if you're working in schools or in community-based organizations. So I want to talk about a paradigm that Kathy Boudin, Cheryl Wilkins, and I have called the punishment paradigm, and the ways in which each of our public institutions is now incorporating a commitment to to punishment. In public schools, that's primarily enacted through the representations of high-stakes testing. How many of you work in public schools or work with public schools? So you know that the morale, the sense of belonging in those schools has just gotten corroded for the young people and for the educators. High-stakes testing is now an industry that brands young people with their place in the society. It now also brands their teachers, and high-stakes testing are increasingly being used to close schools, disproportionately in poor communities, disproportionately in Black communities. What we're seeing is high-stakes testing is a vehicle to legitimate the racial and class segregation of public schools. There's a school in this neighborhood, Brandeis High School, where I wrote a book 100 years ago called Framing Dropouts. More recently, Brandeis was closed, and then it reopened, and one of the small schools that reopened within it was the Frank McCourt School. Anybody familiar with Frank McCourt? Yeah. So Frank McCourt was going to be a great school, and it was going to take a while, and it was a collaboration of Symphony Space and Lincoln Center. But Frank McCourt wasn't going to be Brandeis High School because Frank McCourt had entrance requirements. You had to be a 3 or a 4 on the standardized tests. Anybody know what a 3 or a 4 is? Speak. Say? So it has to do with whether or not you meet or pass the state exam. So if you were 1 or 2, you couldn't go to Frank McCourt. And I was at a meeting where people were talking about Frank McCourt, which is in the building of Louis Brandeis, which served kids from Central and East Harlem. And the folks said, so you're going to need a 3 or 4 to get into the school. That's right. And then somebody said, you know, maybe we need to remove, we don't want our kids going through metal detectors, right? So maybe our kids for Frank McCourt should use the back door, right? And all of a sudden you had the kids for the old Brandeis coming through the front door and the kids from Frank McCourt going through the back door. And some of us said, well, shouldn't Brandeis be serving the very children that it has betrayed for generations? And isn't this a kind of racist strategy of now developing a school for the new local gentry on the Upper West Side, who are the very kids that Patricia was talking about earlier? And somebody from the Board of Ed explained, no, we're going to use race-neutral criteria. We're going to use test scores, attendance, writing samples, and an interview. Right? Well, that's really very interesting that now high-stakes tests are being used as the scientific ink of racial segregation to legitimate the exclusion, and I would say the locking out and the invitation to prison for large numbers of young people whose parents used to attend Brandeis High School. So I don't want us to separate the conversations about prisons from the conversations about high-stakes testing, about privatization. One more example. I was recently in Newark, New Jersey, where the DFER, Democrats for Education Reform, were trying to sell charters to the local community. And they were meeting with parents and saying, you know, your public schools are really messing up. And I can hear Du Bois saying, here it comes. Right? Your public schools are messing up, and what you need here are charters. Right? And I live in New Jersey, so I am watching the tragedy of the illiterate Negro be used as foreplay to privatization across the state as the rationale for closing public schools and reopening them as selective schools, as charter schools, as voucher scams, in New Jersey and in Pennsylvania as online charter schools. Online charter schools called things like Tikkun Olam. Anybody? All right, that's my tribe. All right, so now what we've got is an industry that is excluding large numbers of low-income kids and kids of color from public education. So I'll say CUNY is asking us to remember those in fact behind bars. I would ask us for today and in your work to be thinking of the banal technologies of which we are all engaged that are recruiting some people into institutions like Columbia University, but mostly locking most people out. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to make explicit a connection which I think most of you will have heard in the comments that have been made by the panelists already, and that is the connection, which is obvious once I state it, between the politics of incarceration on one hand and the politics of race. Here are some facts. From 1980 to 2008, the number of people incarcerated in the United States quadrupled from roughly 500,000 to 2.3 million people. As Carl Hart has told us, that is a consequence, not just in large part, but almost completely, of the so-called war on drugs. Today, the US is 5% of the world population and has 25% of world prisoners. Combining the number of people in prison and jail with those under parole or probation supervision, 1 in every 31 adults, or 3.2% of the population, is under some form of correctional control. African Americans now constitute nearly 1 million of the total 2.3 million incarcerated population. African Americans are incarcerated at nearly 6 times the rate of whites. That is roughly the percentage, a factoid about which I happen to know personally, of the difference between the prostate cancer rates of white men and black men, right? Together, African American and Hispanics comprise 58% of all prisoners in 2008, even though African Americans and Hispanics make up approximately 1/4 of the US population. According to Unlocking America, if African American and Hispanics were incarcerated at the same rates of whites, today's prison and jail populations would decline by approximately 50%. Let me repeat that. If African American and Hispanics were incarcerated at the same rate of whites, today's prison and jail populations would decline by approximately 50%. So it's pretty clear to me, looking at these statistics, that to understand incarceration as a political project, right, in which the government, the state, is governing not crime, right, but governing through crime, as Jonathan Simon, the Berkeley scholar, puts it, using crime as a tool or technology of governance, right? Not as a response to a social problem that exists or comes before politics. Then it's also important, I think, if we want to be honest with ourselves, to remind ourselves of the fact that prison and penal policy is maintaining the authority of a racial state under, if not a post-racial moment, a moment in which some people think we're closer to a post-racial society than we've ever been before. And I might add that presiding over this use of prison policy and penal policy and the criminal law as a tool of governing through crime is a president who has been responsible during the time he has been in office for an explosion, a veritable explosion in the use of crime as a tool of governance, right, as a way of responding to the problem, if that's what it is, of immigration, right? So, since 2005, immigration has been criminalized, as one journalist has noted, as never before. So when George W. Bush came into office in 2000, there were about 10,000 convictions for illegal entry and re-entry. 10,000. In 2011, even as the number of people crossing the border had plummeted during the Obama administration, there were more than 71,000 such convictions, a 700% increase. Immigration is now the most prosecuted federal crime, surpassing weapons, white-collar crimes, and even drugs. The article from which I'm reading goes on to say, locking up unprecedented numbers of immigrants has swelled the federal prison system. New prisons are being constructed at a rapid pace, most of them privately run. So we see something going on with respect to the practice of incarceration, which is parallel to the phenomenon that Michele was talking about in the field of education. So the prison, the education to prison pipeline has as its running thread the neoliberal project of reconstructing what used to be government functions as private business, right? Unlike the rest of the Federal Bureau of Prison system, prisons for immigrants are completely privatized. So while the mass criminalization of immigrants has torn parents from their families, removed skilled people from the workforce, and had a debatable impact on border security, the policy has served one interest very well: private prison companies. The United States spends $5 billion a year deporting and detaining undocumented immigrants. So the use of privatization under the neoliberal state, not just to govern through crime, but to make it a profitable enterprise, is, I think, something we have never before seen in the history of the Republic. And the question I would put to the panelists is, how has that been politically possible? What do you think, for example, is the rhetorical politics or the political work that is being done by the rhetoric of war, even as we're ramping down, right? This idea of the war on drugs. Sekou talks in the beginning of the 51st Dream State, right after the passage that I read from earlier, about growing up and being a student when there were only 49 states. And he says that among the kids that he went to school with, there was talk about which state was going to be the next state. Was it going to be Puerto Rico? One of his neighbors said, not over my dead body, right? Was it going to be Hawaii? Right? And he says something to the effect of, I would never have imagined that the 51st state would be the state of war. Right? So we are living at a moment in the history of this republic where war, in the words of the social critic, the pre-World War I social critic Randolph Bourne, war is not only the health of the state, right? But war is the new normal, right, of the state, right? So we have a drug war, we have a war on crime, we have a war on terror. And if you believe with me that language matters, what we've seen is a militarization of the very language that we use to talk about our common political life, right? Such that it is simply impossible to think, much less have a debate about prisons, prisoners, incarceration, and the like, right? Which raises this question as a question of democracy, right? So you have someone like Angela Davis talking about, and I think rightly, the importance of organizing a political project that opposes incarceration, that calls itself abolition democracy, and understands itself as being in the line of abolitionist politics that attack slavery, right? That attack Jim Crow, that attack women's inequality, et cetera. And my question to you would be whether from the locations.
This is the second question, right?
And Marsh is dying to say something to us.
Whether you see, what space you see in the culture, right, for this demilitarization, right, of the way we talk about crime, and the way we talk about prisons.
What I'd just like to say here briefly is that don't get it twisted. The war on drugs is not winding down. We still arrest 1.5, 1.7 million people a year for drugs. And although one of the things that the current administration has been really good at is getting rid of the language of the war on drugs, but the activity remains the same. So when we think about what's happening, the war on drugs is still alive and well. And I think that when we make the shift to think about immigration, I think that's important
But one of the things I want to make sure that we continue to focus on is the lives of the people who have been destroyed as a result of the war on drugs. I mean, you talked about those numbers when you break it down by gender and race and things of that nature, black men make up 6% of the general population here, 35% of the incarcerated population. Then that's when it really gets bad. So you want to make sure that people keep that in their minds, because what has happened on our watch is this sort of new Jim Crow or new slavery, and we have been somewhat complicit. We haven't been as vocal as we should be as a society. I think we are conflicted about how bad or how dangerous drugs are. I think we're really conflicted. And so obviously I know drugs are not as evil or as bad as we have made them out to be. But that will require quite a bit of education for the rest of the general population.
So you see that as one important step?
I think that's critical, because that's an important tool that has been used to further marginalize these folks.
Right, miseducation around drugs.
Absolutely.
Right.
I'm struck by the degree to which, the language of war is only one of the discourses that is at play here, and you mentioned the neoliberal project, but it really is the degree to which profit and money have disguise the degree of brutality that underlies the way in which we have put dollars and cents on lives. Every now and then it becomes very, very clear. I think Stephen Colbert did a kind of parody of Fox News after the death of Ariel Castro, because one of their, didn't have to be parodized. It was one of their newscasters described Ariel Castro's death as saving the taxpayers so much money, and then went into a complete calculus of, the average age is 78 years, and at X numbers of $100,000 a year, we saved $780,000 a year. Therefore, and then he goes on to say maybe about the prisoners in Guantanamo Bay, so sort of like there's almost an economic incentive to suicide. But it was all talked about as dollars and cents. He didn't actually say, let's just all kill them. Let's all just, because that would be the language that would import some kind of constitutional discourse or explicitly talk about the devaluation of human beings. But as long as you're talking about dollars and cents, we almost forget that we are describing human beings as expendable rather than priceless, even when they have committed crimes, horrible crimes. The second thing that is really subtle, but I don't think we have a handle on in terms of its brutality, ultimate brutality, is the degree to which prisons, in their profit mode, the private prisons, are accountable to their stockholders. And that means that, and this is one of the things in Judy Resnick's piece that I was telling you about earlier. Judith Resnick is a wonderful constitutional scholar, and she describes the way in which private prisons actually have a conflict of interest in things like drug decriminalization. And so in their stock reports, they say, well, we didn't quite make as much profit this term because in California there's been a move to decriminalize marijuana ingestion, and therefore we're going to go out and we're going to lobby to make sure that there's less drug decriminalization. Again, this has nothing to do with political welfare or what we think of as citizenship interests. It has everything to do with private profit and dollars and cents. And those kinds of motivations are largely invisible. We don't plug them into our political discourse. It's an insidious product of what you keep referring to as neoliberalism. But I also think we've lost the vocabulary, and when it's put in the vocabulary of private contract and dollars and cents, we don't, we need to retranslate that as, this isn't just about dollars and cents in the bottom profit line of a private prison. It is about it's about a conflict of interest, and when you put conflict of interest, I think the issues leap out more. When you talk about it in constitutional terms as imprisonment for the sake of private greed and wealth, if you analogize it to the contract labor system of the way prisoners were used in Jim Crow, then it becomes perhaps more vivid. But I don't think we've begun that project of translation. Language is important.
And there's another insidious layer. We were in a meeting last week with Jamal Joseph, and he was telling us about how the current economic structure of prison labor is such that prisoners are able to send money to their families and are responsible, many of them, in the eyes of their family, as economic contributors to the welfare of their families in a way that they may not have been when they were out and engaged in crime. And so you have this perverse incentivizing, right, even in terms of how the families of prisoners see them when you have a prison system that is completely structured around profit, even to the point of making sure that the prisoners are producing commodities that can be sold, for which they receive, of course, a pittance. But you have a system in which they are sending money home that is helping feed and clothe and house their families. And so that economization, right, of what used to be viewed in moral or political terms completely shuts out the space for a discussion about the civic and democratic political issues that are in play here.
So can I just add two things? One is Silky Shah, who works at the detention network. I'm looking for Kathy. Anyway, she's a lawyer who works with immigrants. And she tells a story of how she had a client who was picked up, and he wasn't locked up, but he got a bracelet. And so this is a panopticon story. So he got one of those bracelets, and he was driving from Nassau County to Suffolk County with his fiancée, and his bracelet suddenly said, "You have left the master zone. Turn around and return to the master zone." So I think two things are happening. One is that not everybody is ending up in a physical prison these days, but these kind of technologies, panopticon-like technologies that are kind of incarcerating us even as we move through the world. Mothers who are going to social service and saying they're having a hard time with their kids are being threatened with being locked up for child abuse. Women who are experiencing domestic violence, unless they get an order of protection, they're not allowed to get services, and the order of protection then enables the police to lock up the man. So what we're seeing is that systems, I guess my point is that insofar as there's the discourse of war and a neoliberal state that's privileging profit, we are losing the sense of what a democratic public sphere might have been that ever supported people. So when you talk about public schools, now people think of that as a kind of degraded place where there are more cops than counselors and more tests than textbooks. So we've lost the capacity to imagine a public sphere that supports young people, particularly poor young people. And I feel like when I hang out in disinvested schools, I'm watching kind of supply-side criminal justice. That is the production of young people who have very few places to go other than selling drugs, and they're back in Carl's story. But unless we connect the abolition movement to rebuilding a strong and vibrant public sphere for young people with schools that are actually teaching, with housing that is actually available, with an economy that has jobs available to them, I worry that we're dealing with one side of an equation without watching what's happening to young people who have very few places to go.
So I think that one of the, I don't know if we're going to open it up, but I guess one of the things that I hope that we can leave here with this evening is, so we nicely described the problem, but what are the solutions? Mm-hmm. So I hope that we can talk about some of the solutions, and I'll start first with a solution that I think will work, I think that one of the things we need to do in the country, particularly if we are concerned about incarcerating people, drug charges still represent 12% of all criminal charges in the country. And so I argue for decriminalizing all drugs. Decriminalization is not legalization. It will be treated as a traffic violation or so. You might receive a fine or you may not receive a fine. But one of the things that it does is that it no longer allows the state to put a blemish on people's records and throttle their retard their ability to make a contribution to the society. So I think that if there's one thing that you all want to do, argue to change the drug laws, decriminalize drugs across the board.
Thank you for helping us shift into the next stage of our evening and discussion. We're going to ask that if you have a question, that you stand up and state the question from the mic here. And Rich Blint here will help organize that. And what I think I don't know exactly what time it is, but I'm proposing to take maybe, take 2 questions at a time. Can we do that? And then have a response? Yes, sir. Yes.
Is this working?
Yeah, it's 7.
Okay, I just want to add.
Okay, let me take my mic.
It's working, it's working. Testing 1, 2.
Testing 1, 2. Maybe it's my voice that's not working. At any rate, language, I think, is the key to everything that people are talking about here. And the language I'm talking about specifically is what all it's covering. There's too much language covering up what the source of this whole conversation is about. You call it mass incarceration, we call it all of this, all of that. What it is the relegalization of the slave trade. And if you use that language, you open the door to look at the historical facts about how this country has maintained the slave trade throughout all of its history. And now, my heart is with Michele right now, because this pipeline is at the youth of this race. They're gonna stop, they're gonna use kids to fill their prisons. They're going to continue, and the history is there for discrimination against black people in this country by using the criminal justice system.
Thank you.
Thank you, and we can keep our questions as actual questions. We're really grateful. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. So this is not a question. My name is TJ. How you guys doing? Very quickly, I'm a formerly incarcerated person. I got off parole last year. I'm also an activist and a college student and a mentor to young people. My mentor is Professor Jamal Joseph as well. I have mixed feelings about stop and frisk as being someone on both sides of that debate. I am from Brooklyn. I currently live in Brownsville. Violence is pervasive in inner cities. And, but I'm tired of the rhetoric that I see. I also read the Post, by the way, even though it's a tabloid. I'm tired of seeing the rhetoric about, if we stop and frisk, then if we have a description of a crime in progress, then we'll be stymied in stopping those folks. It's nonsense. If you have a description for someone, suspect of a crime in progress, stop them. But the majority of stop and frisk has nothing to do with a crime in progress or a description. That's one. Two, also, in terms of suspicious behavior. If you see suspicious behavior, then stop the person, but the majority of those stops have nothing to do with seeing suspicious behavior. So I don't think that stop and frisk needs to be totally taken out of the picture. I just think that it needs to be fixed because you have a majority of young black males like me who have been told since birth.
How do you fix it?
I think that you shouldn't be stopping young black males and telling them just wholeheartedly just because of young black males.
I want to say something about stop and frisk.
With that.
When we talk about language, so we have a disproportionate number of black and brown people being stopped for stop and frisk. You have a mayor in New York City who says that, who is arguing to justify the program. It's disproportionately impacting people based on race. We call that racial discrimination, and people who support racial discrimination or who have policies that result in racial discrimination, we call them racist. People need to call out the mayor as a racist. The mayor, the problem with the country today is that the only racists we think of or see are people with white sheets or somebody who uses the word nigger, as opposed to the real racists like the mayor. And so until we call those people out, we're going to be here arguing about these things.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Hi, how are you? My name is Five. I'm with the Campaign to End the New Jim Crow. You speak about insidious layers of responsibility of the privatization of prisons. I also work with American Friends Service Committee, who does a lot of privatized prison work. So I wanted to ask you to expound upon the accountability of public prisons, which outweigh the private prisons, because I feel that it tends to be a shift of blame on the privatization of prisons, like you have Kerry in Texas, who takes money from the privatization of prisons like CCA and GEO to fund in his campaigns and political measures to actually go to corporations and to contract out to the prisons. But we also have a fundamental addiction to not only incarcerating our citizens, but also in making profit off of them in the states. And we all have an accountability inside the communities, which we employ, we work to them. Private organizations and companies and businesses contract out to the prisons. So what is the solution besides caring communities, fundamentally, economically, to reduce that? If you have any suggestions or projections behind that.
Does anybody want to address that? I'm not entirely sure that I got the question, but.
The question is suggestions to release the financial dependability from the prisons as a complex on a state level, not just on the privatization.
I see in terms of public.
Which outweighs privatization.
Which outweighs privatization, right?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I don't think any of this means that one is not also concerned about public prisons, which is where the majority of prisoners are held. I think the concern about private prisons is that they are growing at such a rate that the kinds of constitutional claims one has. I mean, again, public prisons are in deep, deep trouble, but at least they fall within a constitutional discourse of public accountability and of civil rights and human rights. The extent to which private prisons, increasing in their existence, are introducing a discourse and a space in which even those claims are no longer the metrics are changing is the concern. This does not displace, it's in addition to, it does not displace the general concern about how unaccountable prisons have actually been, regardless of the ostensible appeals to accountability that the Constitution or prison jurisprudence supposedly provides. All of this is out of control if by a slightly different set of metrics. But it's true. Even for public prisons, the underlying appeal of prison expansion in communities, for example, and I remember going to Waynesburg, Pennsylvania, right after a huge supermax prison had been built there. a federal supermax prison, and where Mumia Abu Jamal is actually, and that community begged and pleaded to have that prison there. They lobbied to have that prison there as a matter of public accountability because farming and the steel industry had gone under. But that affects not just the prisoners who are so far from the communities where their families and support systems are. It affects that community. It dehumanizes that community. And in fact, I remember getting lost in a snowstorm on my way to visit that facility and ending up turning right as opposed to left. I ended up at the high school. I went in and said, where is the prison? And they said, oh, well, right here, this is Progress Road. You just make a right on Progress Road and go down to the end of the street, and that's where the prison is. And literally, it was a slide down the hill from the high school to the prison, where the good citizens of Waynesburg, Pennsylvania, are all employed in this very grim, sad industry.
Kendall, I'm sorry.
Just also, I just want to reinforce that all of these institutions are sadistic institutions. I remember after Abu Ghraib, there was a conference on whether or not Abu Ghraib had anything to say about what was happening in prisons in this country, and there was a lot of outcry that enabled people to talk about the kinds of perverse relationships of power and abuse that constituted prisons, whether they were public or private. And just to your point, I think even in public prisons, there are a number of privatizing interests. Exactly. So we're privatizing mental health services, which means people aren't getting counseling, they're getting meds. That we're privatizing a whole set of the services from within. It's like in public schools. It's not like there's private schools and public schools anymore. There are a whole set of privatizing interests that are kind of corroding and curdling the insides of institutions that we even think of as public.
We have time for one more question.
Yeah, I just wanted to pull the lens back a second. I mean, if you have a society that's that's increased incarceration by 800% in just a few decades, and it's a society that its foundation is slavery, then is there anything commensurate with how you would actually solve the problem by any of the things that we've been talking about tonight? Or do we actually have to look at a political system that requires this level of control, counterinsurgency before insurgency, if you will? And can we actually think about isn't it time that we actually thought about a whole different way to organize society? Because if you've got a situation where you cannot employ black youth and they will never get jobs, those jobs are gone. They're in Indonesia, they're in China, where people are forced to work $1 a day. That's where they are, they're not coming back. Can we now at least begin? I'm from Revolution Books. We talk about revolution, like tonight, we're talking about the shutdown at Revolution, of the government at Revolution Books, and from a point of view of can humanity do better than this? Because I think we can, and if we don't start talking about that in these public forums, and all across this country in a big freaking hurry, a lot of more people are going to die and their lives ground up. And that's just here, not to mention what's going on all across the planet in our name.
Well, you've thrown down a very powerful challenge, trying to talk to people about the kind of society that we want, right? We want a society in which we do not put people in prison, right? We were in a meeting the other day and I heard myself saying that in a society that governs through crime, all prisoners are political prisoners, right? Where incarceration is integral a part of what the government is. All prisoners are political prisoners. And if we start from that assertion and that insistence, we can begin to do some of the hard work of thinking out loud about a society that we want, where the government in our name is not using incarceration to rip citizenship from not just individuals, but from entire communities, both politically and economically. We are now going to segue into the next part of our program, but before we do so, I wanted to call your attention to a conference that's taking place tomorrow and Saturday called Challenging Punishment, Race, the People's Health, and the War on Drugs. I don't know if there are any additional flyers out back, but if you go on the website of the Institute for Research in African American Studies here at Columbia University, you will get the schedule. The conference is going on in a number of locations, both on campus at Low Library and at the Riverside Church, as well as at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. So this will be an opportunity to talk in very specific ways about one piece of the problem that we have been discussing this evening. So I think I'm going to turn things over to Rich Blint at this point, and we will take it from here.